At a nursing home, there was this old guy sitting back, lost in thought, probably replaying the golden days of his youth. His name? Frank Sheeran. Once upon a time, Frank had a regular, hard-working gig as a delivery driver for a slaughterhouse. For 8 solid years, he busted his back without ever taking a day off, but no matter how much effort he put in, the paycheck barely covered his family's needs. One day, life threw him a curveball. His truck broke down near some gas station. While he was trying to figure out what to do, a middle-aged man stepped in to lend a hand. This guy introduced himself as Russell Buffalino. Frank was grateful for the help, exchanged a few words with Russell, and then went back to his grind. That night, while unwinding at a bar, Frank crossed paths with a restaurant owner who went by the nickname Skinny Razor. Frank, always looking for a side hustle, pitched him some steak at a discounted rate. Skinny, however, wasn't immediately sold and wanted to sample the goods first. The next day, Frank returned to work as usual. He asked the guys at the slaughterhouse for more meat to deliver, but they couldn't care less about his request. They handed him a seal to lock up the truck and sent him on his way. But Frank had a plan. He made his first stop at Skinny's place, dropped off some quality cuts, and then sealed up the truck before continuing his rounds. This little routine became his new norm. Frank even spread the extra cash he earned around, sharing it with his co-workers. Skinny, impressed with the quality, started ordering more, and before long, Frank was dedicating all his deliveries to Skinny. Eventually, this caught the attention of Frank's boss, who wasn't too happy about it. The boss accused him of stealing and decided to press charges. Frank, now in hot water, needed a lawyer, and that's when he crossed paths with William Buffalino, an attorney with a reputation for defending even the guiltiest clients. William asked Frank straight up why he'd been helping himself to the meat. Frank didn't hold back. He told him about the years of grueling work without a raise. William used that story to flip the courtroom narrative, turning the heat on Frank's boss instead. The judge wasn't having any of the boss's complaints and ruled in Frank's favor, even warning the boss not to bother Frank again. After the courtroom victory, William took Frank out to celebrate at Skinny's restaurant. It was there that Frank discovered William was related to Russell Buffalino, the guy who had helped him fix his truck. Also at the restaurant was a powerful mafia boss named Bruno, who couldn't help but eye Frank throughout the evening. Russell, it turned out, had taken a liking to Frank since the day they met. He was especially impressed when he learned that Frank, despite being Irish, could speak Italian, a skill he picked up during his 4 years in the war. Frank wasn't exactly a saint during those years. One grim story he shared involved making 2 war prisoners dig a hole, only to execute them afterward. After leaving the slaughterhouse, Frank started working for Russell, who ran a small curtain shop as a front for his mob activities. Russell was a big deal in the underworld, known for solving problems, whether it meant taking over a business, bribing officials, or even taking someone out. His influence was so massive that even other mobsters needed his green light to carry out hits. Frank became one of Russell's trusted guys, handling tasks like collecting overdue payments. Frank wasn't the kind to use violence unnecessarily, but he was no pushover either. When a grocery store owner upset his daughter, Frank didn't hesitate to march over and teach the guy a lesson, leaving him with a broken hand. Their bond grew so strong that Russell became the godfather to one of Frank's kids. At one point, Frank took on a job to destroy a laundromat that was causing trouble for another mafia. But things got complicated when Bruno, who partly owned the laundromat, found out. Furious, Bruno demanded compensation, and to make amends, Frank had to work for him. His first assignment? Eliminate the guy who'd ordered the laundromat hit. From there, Frank's role in the mob expanded, and he became a go-to hitman, often working for Russell without expecting payment as a sign of loyalty. With time, Frank's life took a turn for the better. He could finally provide for his family, take days off, and enjoy life a little more. Russell became almost like family, doting on Frank's kids as if they were his own. This bond led Russell to introduce Frank to Jimmy Hoffa, the head of the Teamsters Union and one of the most powerful men in America at the time. Jimmy had Frank handle a dispute in Chicago involving a taxi business. Frank devised a plan to crush the competition and bring profits back to Jimmy's ally, Salerno. The plan worked like a charm, and afterward, Jimmy invited Frank to stay at his house, deepening their friendship. As Frank got closer to Jimmy, he started to uncover the darker side of the union's operations. Jimmy was using pension funds to lend money to the mob at high interest rates, fueling ventures like the gambling industry in Las Vegas. Some of this money even found its way to influential figures like Sam Giancana, who had ties to the Kennedy family. Jimmy wasn't thrilled when John F. Kennedy became president. fearing it would disrupt his shady dealings. His concerns grew when JFK's brother, Robert, was appointed Attorney General and started cracking down on organized crime. Things got heated, with Jimmy losing his temper and lashing out at his team, including Frank. He quickly apologized, though, knowing he needed Frank's loyalty. Robert Kennedy began targeting Jimmy, especially after discovering that Jimmy had funneled union funds to Nixon's failed presidential campaign. As the pressure mounted, Jimmy relied on Frank more than ever. He even proposed that Frank take on a leadership role in the union, a move that cemented Frank's rise in the ranks. But Jimmy's troubles didn't stop there. During one of his trials, there was an attempt on his life. From that point on, Jimmy was heavily guarded, but the cracks in his empire were beginning to show. Jimmy's crew wasn't just focused on his trial. They started digging into the backgrounds of the reporters and witnesses showing up for it. They'd snoop on every mistake they ever made, then use that dirt to blackmail them into pulling back their statements. One day, while Jimmy and Russell were sipping coffee, news broke about JFK being shot and killed. Jimmy was ecstatic about it. Why? Because with John F. Kennedy gone, his brother Robert Kennedy, who was Attorney General, lost the leverage he had to keep coming after Jimmy. Jimmy was so overjoyed he didn't even allow anyone at the Union office to mourn JFK's death. Still, none of that mattered to the jury. Their decision was set in stone. Jimmy ended up being sentenced to 5 years in prison, though he kept the union's money-lending operations running even behind bars. Jimmy had it all figured out before his sentence. He'd handed over control to his trusted guy, Fitz, as the acting president of the union. Meanwhile, Russell, who couldn't stand a guy named Allen, was running into trouble. Allen kept blocking union loans to the mafia, even when Fitz approved them. Russell wasn't having it, so he told Frank to give Allen a lesson. The next day, Frank unloaded gunfire on Allen to make it clear he needed to stop playing hardball. Allen got the message and didn't mess with the mafia's loans again. On a different note, Tony ended up getting busted by the FBI and was sentenced to 7 years in the same prison as Jimmy. While they were in the prison cafeteria one day, Tony confronted Jimmy about $1.2 million of his retirement fund that had mysteriously vanished. Jimmy's pension fund, which was worth way more, was untouched. Tony was furious. Jimmy calmly told him their situations were different. Tony was locked up for extortion, while Jimmy's case was just fraud. Tony didn't care about the explanation, and the argument turned into a brawl. Meanwhile, Russell had his own beef with a mobster named Crazy Joe Gallo. Russell couldn't stand the guy's disrespect and temper. At Russell's birthday party, Joe had the nerve to mock him in front of everyone, so Frank had to drag him away. Joe didn't apologize, though. He just kept acting like he was better than everyone else and walked out with a smirk. Russell was seething, and Frank could see what was coming next. It didn't take long. One evening, while Joe was having dinner with his wife and kids, Frank walked into the restaurant and shot him dead right there in front of his family. The next morning, Frank was having breakfast while the news of Joe's murder played on TV. Peggy, Frank's daughter, instantly knew her dad was behind it. Time passed, and President Nixon got elected. He remembered Jimmy's $500,000 contribution to his campaign, so he pulled some strings and got Jimmy out on parole. Jimmy was finally free, but things had changed. Fitz was fully in charge of the union, and Jimmy wasn't happy about it. He was determined to take back control, but his feud with Tony made things tricky. At a Florida meeting, Jimmy and Tony clashed again, and it quickly turned into another fight. On the ride home, Jimmy asked Frank to get Russell's okay to take Tony out permanently. Frank warned Jimmy it wouldn't be easy and tried to convince him that reclaiming the union wasn't worth it. But Jimmy wouldn't back down. He started using the media to go after Fitz and Tony, accusing them of corruption and shady dealings. Fitz retaliated by blowing up a boat owned by one of Jimmy's friends. Jimmy responded by planting a bomb in Fitz's son's car. Things escalated fast. Fitz then fired Jimmy's wife from her job at a union branch office, pushing Jimmy over the edge. He went to the media again, this time accusing Fitz of loaning union pension funds to the mafia for illegal activities. Salerno, a major mob boss who frequently borrowed from the union, wasn't pleased. Jimmy's accusations were putting the mafia in danger, so Salerno asked Frank to talk some sense into him. Frank passed along Salerno's message, urging Jimmy to take his pension and live a quiet life with his grandson. But Jimmy was too stubborn. He refused to retire and kept pushing to regain control of the union. Frank was stuck in the middle. Jimmy was his friend, but his actions were making him a target for the mafia. To make matters worse, the mafia started to view Frank as a liability because of his loyalty to Jimmy. Russell tried to mediate by hosting a big meeting with the mafia, hoping to show Jimmy how his actions were affecting everyone. Salerno reported that Jimmy's influence was preventing loans from being approved, which was causing chaos among the mob. Some feared it could lead to an all-out mafia war. Russell pleaded with Jimmy to compromise, but Jimmy wouldn't budge. He even suggested that the mafia help him reclaim the union if they wanted continued access to its funds. Russell and Frank were running out of options. Russell eventually decided there was only one solution left. He gave Frank a ring identical to his own, symbolizing his elevated status within the mafia, and tasked him with stopping Jimmy once and for all. Frank was heartbroken, but knew he had no choice. Russell set up a meeting in Detroit, and Frank knew exactly what it meant. He flew there, feeling the weight of what he had to do. Jimmy's son picked him and another associate, Sally, up, and they drove to meet Jimmy. Once they arrived, Jimmy and Frank entered the house. When Jimmy realized no one else was there, he got irritated and prepared to leave. That's when Frank pulled out a gun and shot him. Sally and Tony disposed of Jimmy's body by cremating it, leaving no trace of evidence. Jimmy's disappearance didn't fix anything. It only made matters worse. Sally started taking out Tony's rivals to secure his position, creating even more tension. Russell couldn't allow that to continue, so he sent Frank to eliminate Sally. Shortly after, the FBI managed to arrest both Russell and Frank. However, Russell had already destroyed any evidence linking Frank to Jimmy's murder. Frank was only charged for unrelated crimes and had some of his assets confiscated to lessen his sentence. As time went on, the main players began to face the consequences of their actions. Salerno developed cancer, Russell had a stroke, and Frank struggled with arthritis. Russell, in his final days, regretted everything. He felt they should have supported Jimmy instead of turning against him. But it was too late. After serving his time, Frank was released, but he was old, lonely, and dependent on medication. His daughter, Peggy, who had long suspected the truth, refused to see him. Frank was consumed by guilt. He went to a coffin dealer, bought his own casket, and prepaid for his funeral. With everyone he cared about gone, Frank decided to confess everything to a priest, revealing all the secrets he had kept hidden for years. The truth about the mafia and Jimmy's death would die with him.